Good morning. It is an honor to be able to be here with all of you today. And when the invitation came to speak, I had to pause in my email and read it. And why me? Which is a really important question to ask, as I learned from my good friend, Pastor Tim Ahrens, who lives in the community here as well. Why me is always a question that I ask, and I think in many ways it really reflects a little bit about kind of a sense of what is it that I can offer. And as I think about today, I think about that I hope that I can offer you something that you can carry with you, even if it's just one thing that you might take away that will build on the rest of this day and take you into your classrooms where you can put some of these concepts that we're going to be talking about today into practice. How one goes from studying to be a high school Spanish teacher to being a rabbi is a story that I'll have to share with you another time. But I want to begin by just saying thank you. Before I really speak with the rabbi kippah on, I want to speak with the parent kippah on. And I want to say thank you because I know that these last few years have been incredibly challenging. And when we learn how to teach, we learn how to work with students in certain ways. And then all of a sudden, for so long, they were behind computer screens, and we were fighting with them to turn on their screens and figuring out ways in which we could guide them and teach them. And the core piece of what we love to do and build relationships with our students and learners became so much more challenging. And I want to thank you for persevering. I want to thank those of you who are new to teaching in the last couple of years for sticking with it, saying you still wanted to come here and figuring out how to make it through and getting your licensing and doing all that teacher training in a way that was so foreign to us. It hasn't been easy. I turned to my synagogue board in August and I said, it's finally starting to feel a bit normal again. And I hope that this particular year, as you've spent these last couple of months in your classrooms, has felt a little bit more normal, like what it had been before, but perhaps a little bit different too, because we've all been changed and we've all been impacted by the experiences that we've had over these last couple of years. So I begin by saying thank you, because I know that we're never thanked enough. And as a parent, I want to say thank you for all that you have done and all that you have given to our students here, my own kids personally, and all of the other students in the district. You're shaping lives, and you're really being an impact for them. So I want to begin a little bit by talking about culturally responsive education. It's really an exciting approach to learning. And I will tell you, when I first began discovering culturally responsive education, I was struck by where it came from and how it was rooted. And when you learn Zaretta Hammond's story, it began for her as a child when she used her grandparents' address in San Francisco to get into a school that was better than the neighborhood that she lived in. She grew up living in the projects, but she used her parents' neighborhood. The principal looked the other way. She was guided. She was one of 5 students of color in her classroom, or in her school, and she was shaped, and she grew, and she learned. And then by the time she got to 5th grade, the school was integrated. And she realized that the students who were coming in who had gone to another school, they learned differently. They hadn't been given that sense of rigor that she had. And from there, she understood that there's a way that our brains can grow, our way that we approach the world can grow, how we're shaped and how we're guided in how we respond to all of the aspects of our learning can change based on how we're taught, based on the faith that people put in us and the potential that people see in us. And that learning and education doesn't have to be watered down. I'm struck by what culturally responsive education is. And I would first thought it's about how do we celebrate and honor the traditions of our students. What are their holidays? What are the foods that they eat? That is very much a celebration of diversity. But it goes deeper than that. There are values, there are norms, there are behaviors that result from those norms. And then on the deepest level, there is deep culture. And it's how our brain makes sense of the world around us. How we respond to all of those impulses and those things that help us understand the world. That's shaped from the time we're young. They're shaped from the values that we learn in our homes, from the values that we learn based on the culture in which we are raised. So how do we teach that? Well, we might be in a classroom with 25 different learners. There are probably 25 different cultures. And how we understand that is what Zaretta Hammond says is being a different kind of teacher who is relationship with the student and the content in a different way. As teachers, we stand in the middle. We have the content that we want to teach, and we have the relationship. The content, fortunately, we hope we're experts in. The students, that's the place where we have to learn, how we figure out how to reach them. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today. You've been asked to focus on chapter 6 of Zaretta Hammond's book. But before we even get to chapter 6, there's so many important values that are taught in the first few chapters of her book that I want to try to really deepen and understand. I'm going to let the focus pieces that are dealing with the scientific part of the brain go, although if you're a science teacher, I will say, go into those chapters. That was really fascinating, and it's something in a place for me to learn, but I'm going to let that go, but even though I think it's actually really, really important. But I thought, well, how do we get to chapter 6? It's, for those who are baseball fans and you watch extra innings, it's like putting that phantom runner on second base. Like, you just can't show up on second base. You got to earn it. You got to get there, and that's where all the foundational parts of what it means to be a culturally responsive teacher is. It's about building relationships. It's about growth. And it's about ultimately building an alliance. And so those are the three kind of takeaways that I want to focus on today. And I want to begin with stories, and I want to use stories to tell and show some of these examples, because as Zaretta Hammond tells us in her book, it's so critical to begin with stories because we're story people. We live on stories. Our cultures come from oral traditions, and as a rabbi, what we do is tell stories. When I give a sermon on the Sabbath, I know that they're not going to remember the sermon, or they're not going to remember the whole sermon, but what they're going to remember is the stories. So you might remember the stories today. You might not remember everything I tell you, but I hope that you'll remember the stories that will then ultimately build ways for us to respond. How do we build relationships? Well, I want to start with a story. These are Hasidic stories. The Hasidic tradition is a Jewish response to the darkness in the world. It begins in the 18th century in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and continues into the 19th century. And the rabbis would go from town to town and share their wisdom. But they use stories because stories are timeless. Stories have enduring values, and at any time and at any place, we can access those stories and share those lessons. So this is a story of a rabbi who arrives at an inn in his travels. And after a long day of traveling, he sits down. It's great. What time is it? 9 o'clock in the morning. He sits down at a bar. And there are a couple of townsfolk who have spent a little bit more time at the bar. They've had a little bit too much to drink. They're a little bit inebriated. And they're talking, and one of them says to his friend, "Do you love me?" "Of course I love you." He says to his friend, No. "Do you really, really love me?" And the friend said, "Of course I love you. You're my best friend. I've always, I love you. We're friends. We get together all the time. I love you." And he said, No. "Do you really love me? Do you know what I need? Do you know my fears? Do you know my pain?" And he says, "How can I possibly know your pain? How can I possibly know your fears?" And the first person who asked the question then answers, "How can you say you love me when you don't know what I need, when you don't know my pain, when you don't know my fears?" This is being in a culturally responsive classroom. It's about knowing who our students are. And it's about knowing, in some instances, what brings them fear. And I want to begin with a story that exemplifies this, and it's a true story. And I've spoken with the teachers who are in the room who are part of this story, so they knew I was going to tell the story. But it happened to my daughter Zoe, who's now a freshman over at Kilbourne. But a year ago, she was asked to write an assignment in Mr. Kabila's class over at Phoenix about this is the story of us, and about a problem that existed in the world and how it still, years ago, and how it still exists in the world today. I hope I got that right, more or less. But she wrote about her own experience with anti-Semitism and her own fears of what it means to be a Jew in the world at the time in 2021. She was given the opportunity to explore those fears. And then, 6 months later, as she was gearing up to read Elie Wiesel's Night in the classroom, being the only Jewish student in her grade, in her school, that became a source of more anxiety and fear for her. Because she didn't know how other students would react. Even though she was friends with so many of them, even though she knew them and had spent 2 years with them in school, sort of, 7th grade was a little kind of on that wonky side of things, but she spent the time with them. And sure enough, so we as parents said, let's read the book at home first, so you kind of have an understanding of what the book is about, and Elie Wiesel's story as he survived Auschwitz. She reads this story. Sure enough, it's a Wednesday afternoon in March. It's about 1:56 p.m. I tell you the time because at 2 o'clock I'm standing outside of my sanctuary. I have a memorial service to lead. She's texted me, sorry. But it's a problem. About a minute later, I get a call, and it's like, oh my gosh, why is the Worthington School District calling me for some reason? Well, what had happened in that moment was a note was found on the floor, was picked up and handed to her. And it said on the note, "Hitler is my daddy. I love him." Her fears were brought to life. Thank God we live in a wonderful school district with wonderful teachers and wonderful administrators. I was able to speak with Mr. Flynn. Sorry, I didn't tell you I was going to tell this story to Mr. Flynn. But Mr. Beck and Mr. Flynn worked together to respond in a way that helped move Zoe from fear and rebuild that trust. What did we do? What did they do? They brought in Debbie Sugarman, whose father survived Auschwitz, who spoke to the students within the next week or two about her father's story. They got deeper and showed their support and understanding how much it means to get into the real stories and to show that this is not a joking matter. We were able to move from fear to trust. And that was enabling us to really get an understanding of how challenging it can be in that classroom. How challenging it can be when we don't have that trust. But we come from a place of fear. We have so many students who might have fears that we don't even know about. Whether they're marginalized, whether they're refugees, whether they come from overseas, they don't speak the language. There are so many different fears that can be presented or even hidden. And how do we get there? We have to ask and dig deeper about those fears. One of the things we have to learn is where we come from. Where are our biases? What I want you to do, I'm trying to think what kind of time we have here. I hope this works, by the way. Scan that. It should take you to a Google Doc that God willing, I shared properly. But in Zaretta Hammond's book, she asks a number of questions on the different levels of what does it mean to understand your culture. And it's that first level that she says is kind of our where we come from, what are our holidays, what are the things that we celebrate, what are our foods. And then on that second level, it's really kind of digging into our worldview and showing what she calls the surface cultural beliefs, moving to the shallow cultural beliefs, and then on our deep cultural beliefs. What I want you to do is I want you to take a look for just a minute at some of the questions of the deep cultural beliefs and of the surface cultural beliefs and the shallow cultural beliefs. And I want to invite you to turn to a neighbor. This will be best done in groups of 2. But if you have to be a group of 3, we're going to modify the time. You'll have to monitor, I'll probably monitor for you, but monitor your time. Look at some of those questions. Pick a question on each one that you want to answer. Because one thing we have to do when we're exploring this is figuring out where we come from. And we can't help understand, figure out where our students come from unless we know where we come from and the values that we bring to our classroom. So I'm going to give you like 5 minutes. Turn to a teacher, give you each a couple of minutes to share. If you finish sharing your question, go to another question. So let's turn to, have you all been able to find this, by the way? Is it working well? Great, there'll be hundreds of you on my Google Doc. That's never happened before. Take 5 minutes. Okay, I'll give you about a 2.5-minute warning. If you want to go back and forth, that's up to you. But you can start with one person and then shift to the other, and then we'll go. If you're a group of 3, I'll try to remember the time. You get about 1 minute and 40 seconds at that waiting place. Like a song to play when this was done.
We're coming back together. If you can hear me, go ahead and give your attention to Rabbi Kellner.
So, there we go. So before we move forward, I want you to take a look at those bottom questions and start to formulate some answers in your head about those deep cultural values, that third tier. What are the cultural values that you were taught that are related to communication and doing school and self-motivation? What are the learning behaviors that you think every student should exhibit? Right? These are the things that we need to be thinking about because we've all been conditioned to think a certain way. Perhaps it's where we've grown up, perhaps it's how we've grown up. There are so many different factors that shape who we are and what those values are that we have been taught that guide those answers and then how we behave and how we respond to our students. In Zaretta Hammond's book, she tells a story. It's quoting another book about a young man named James who gets up. He's a student of color. Gets up in the classroom and is at the pencil sharpener. The teacher, who's white, says to James, "James, you want to go back to your seat now?" And James says, "No." The teacher responds pretty angrily, as if she's being disrespected. So she sends James to the principal's office. "James, what happened?" "Well, the teacher asked me a question, and I answered." Right? The teacher wanted him to go back to his seat. And James was taught his culture to understand, grown up to understand that if someone asks you a question, you give the answer. So that's all he was doing. And what Zaretta Hammond is guiding us to think about is in what ways do our cultural reference points condition our response? As teachers, we have a ways to respond. We can get angry because we might think we're being disrespected, or we might for a moment think that there is another answer. In the Jewish tradition, we have this Hebrew phrase called davar acher, which means literally an alternative approach, another answer. We use that when we're thinking about commentating on things, but I think it's a really practical approach that I actually talk when I teach my parents who are teens. I say to them, this is a great way to think about it, like what's another way? And because we might see the world one way and we might have to go through instantaneously and take a pause and a deep breath and step back from where our initial response is to say, okay, wait a minute. James answered the question. What was my question, telling him what I needed him to do? And instead of asking the question, do you want to go back to your seat? James, when you're finished sharpening your pencil, please go back to your seat, right? Instead of getting angry, what's the language cues that we can give, right? That's a real practical example that we can understand from Hammond's work. I want to shift gears and think a little bit about growth. And there's this this quote from the Talmud, which is written in about the 5th or 6th century. I like to call it the world's first virtual classroom. I actually learned earlier this year that this piece of wisdom is also in the Quran as well. I did not know that. But it's a teaching that says whoever saves a life, it is as if you have saved an entire world. Whoever destroys a life, it is as if you destroyed an entire world. And I think a little bit about our students, and our students are entire worlds. And we have the potential to save them. We have the potential to really guide them and be that person who can influence them along their journey. And I think about a particular student who is a graduate of Worthington Schools. He grew up at Beth Tikva. He was Jewish, or he is Jewish. He's also an African American. And I think about a story that happened to him, and how did I get to know this young man? We'll call him Joe. That's not his name. Joe loved to play the guitar, loved music. And so what I would do is I hired him and I said, Joe, I need you to come once a month and set up our microphones and run our sound, and because we got a band playing, and I just need someone to do it, and they help. And so I would pay him, I don't know, maybe $25 to come and do this once a month. At one point, Joe comes to me and he's very honest, and he says, Rabbi, I've been doing drugs. We talked deeply about that. And I had to make a decision about what I was going to do about Joe. How could I get him help? What could I do? So we tried those avenues. We talked to Joe's parents. I thought about to myself, should I keep hiring him? Is the money I'm paying him going to those drugs? I still paid monthly, so that he could come and do that work. I became less concerned about where the money was going, but I thought that the time I was investing in him would ultimately prove to be valuable. But one day, I get a call from Joe's mom. The police came to school. They gave everybody a moment that if you have drugs on site, and you turn them in, no penalty. Well, Joe's drugs were in his car. So he goes out to his car, and in his car was a knife. I didn't know this at the time, but there are certain knives that if they are above a certain length, that it is the equivalent of bringing a gun to school, from the way the perspective of the law works. Well, Joe was about to face an expulsion hearing. I love this kid. I cared so deeply about him. I think this might have been the first time I met Neil. I came as a character witness. I came as a character witness to that expulsion hearing. I actually don't know. I know what the outcome was. I don't know what the potential end results could have been, but I know that he was expelled for the rest of the semester and finished his learning over at Worthington Academy, which I think was the greatest gift for this young man. Took him out of that environment that was causing harm and causing damage. Went over to Worthington Academy, finished school, how much time he remained in school. And I want to tell you what happened to Joe. Joe joined the Marines. Joe didn't have always the easiest time being a Marine, not because of what he was doing, just because I think at the time he was serving was not easy. He was in Afghanistan a year ago during the withdrawal of our troops. What's Joe doing now? He's studying to be a nurse. Right, so the question I think about when I think about Joe is, so many of us could have looked at Joe as a total failure, so not worth our time. But I think because of the folks that invested in him, the teachers, Worthington Academy, the teachers where he was going to high school here, me, the team around him, invested in him, and I think, We saved a life. We saved an entire world. There's a part of me that wonders, well, I know why he had that knife in his car. Because it was his parents that taught him that if you get into a car accident, you need a way to cut out your seatbelt. Is that cultural? It was not something that I ever thought about when I was raised. I don't know where it came from. I never actually asked that question. But I think about that. And I think about what might have happened if we didn't invest in him. Would we have saved his life in a way that's now allowing him to serve others and learn to be a nurse? There's so much of what we do that is so critical to how our kids can grow, how our kids can learn. And there's a teaching, another Hasidic teaching of a rabbi. His name is Zuzia, and they say to Rabbi Zuzia, when you get to heaven, they're not going to ask you why you weren't Moses. They're going to ask you why you weren't Zuzia, why you weren't the best version of yourself. That is so important, and that's how we figure out how we can understand our students, is figuring out where they're coming from and how they go from the place that they are to the place that they hope to become. I'm thinking about my own work, and when I have my 13-year-olds who are standing on the bima, which is the Hebrew word for stage, and they're standing there, they've just celebrated leading our service, they've celebrated reading Torah, they've been on this journey for their entire lives, they've been really hyper-focused the last 6 months on really preparing to lead us in prayer and read Torah. I have like 5 minutes to tell them everything I think is important to them, because I'm afraid I don't know what I might have the opportunity to teach them about life and about how to be in the world. Well, I used to give this like canned talk, right? You got to do justice, and you got to follow the teachings of our tradition. And I said, I don't know that I'm reaching them. I'm not sure that they're understanding me. It's kind of like the phone call on Charlie Brown. So a number of years ago, I said, how do I meet those kids where they are? Let me ask them what their passions are. What do they love to do? What are they excited about? What are they spending their time doing when they're not in school and they're not studying for their bar or bat mitzvah? I get all sorts of answers. I play lots of sports, right? Soccer, field hockey, football, baseball. I get basketball, all those sports. I've gotten video games. Right, our 13-year-olds, they love their video games, maybe even older, 15, 16 too. They love their video games. But what do? I take what they've taught me, and I think a little bit about that, and I take the metaphor of what they've taught me, and I speak to them through their loves and their passions. It's not exactly culturally responsive education, but it's actually starting from their place and figuring out. A few weeks ago, I got a kid who played rugby. It's like, what was the metaphor that I taught with that? I said, well, sometimes when you play rugby, it's like you move forward and you get stuck in the scrum. And sometimes you actually have to move backward to go and move the ball forward. He also was a student of World War I and World War II history. There are not many 13-year-olds who love World War I, World War II history. And then we talked about what were the lessons that we carried forward from the past that can really be responsive for the future. And so we talked about his passions, and we talked about how we can how I can share with him something that he might carry forward, because it started with him. The message itself, the content that I wanted to share is the same, but because I'm starting with him, I think he was able to hear the message a little bit differently. One of the things that Zaretta Hammond teaches us is that when we look at the educational experiences of many groups, marginalized by race, language, or socioeconomics, we see that they often get a watered-down curriculum that doesn't require higher-order thinking. Consequently, they don't build the capacity to do higher-order thinking on their own. To empower dependent learners and help them become independent learners, the brain needs to be challenged and stretched beyond its comfort zone with cognitive routines and strategy. To me, when I read this, it's about those strategies. What is it that we can do to speak to the students? There are times that we get stuck. There are times that we've got challenges. There are times that we can think a little bit about how we can figure out where there's space for the student to grow in our learning. And I want to think about how we come with this fixed mindset versus this growth mindset. So Angie mentioned that I love Peloton. Okay? Any Peloton folks out there? A few. Well, not as many as I might have thought, actually. That's maybe tells you a little bit about why Peloton stocks are struggling. I don't know. Well, I love Peloton. There's a really interesting series about which Ashton Kutcher was interviewing other celebrities on their on their concepts of what they want to be for their future selves, and he's interviewing Natalie Portman. Natalie Portman actually grew up a few towns away from me. She's a little younger than I am. Similar mindset probably to how we were raised. She said, "Oh, I would get that 98, and then and you could either use that 98 and say, is it a fixed way? It's like just like I'm going to take it." And but she said, "My dad taught me." Well, she said she would come over, and Dad would say, "What happened to the other 2 points?" But she said, it's about wanting to be better. It's about wanting to grow. And sometimes when our students, they continue to not actually have success, they kind of get stuck in that fixed mindset and tell these messages to themselves. But it's up to us to actually figure out that pathway to get them forward and moving forward. So how do we make space for kids to have choice in learning? How can we start with stories of our learners and think about ways that we can co-construct that learning environment, right? It's about making space for the student. And I think a little bit has to happen when we start with them. I'm going to take a brief pause for my science and math teachers. So I have to say, when I was figuring out what I might say, I said, what am I going to say that's going to move the science and the math teachers, right? How does this work? Because I can only imagine. Well, I have formulas. I've got. It's set, right? There's not exactly space for that culturally responsive stuff in the classroom. So my dad. I'm the child of 2 teachers. My mom, of blessed memory, was a Spanish teacher, high school assistant principal, eventually started to teach teachers. She worked, for those of you, I don't even know, the EdTPA, do we have to do that? My mom, I know. I heard about it from my mom saying, yeah, right. I think they got rid of it. But my mom would sit with the teachers that she would teach for years over in New York and help guide them and help them get to that place where they could pass the EdTPA. I don't know what the right words is. But then I said, my mom passed away. I would have talked about this with my mom, but I talked about it with my dad, who's been teaching since 1968, since Lyndon Johnson was president. Teaching since 1968, taught high school math, became a math department chair for 37 years, now teaches college statistics and continues to teach teachers. I said, what is it about this? How do you make space in your classrooms? And sometimes it's not always about the stories. And this is what Zaretta Hammond talks about. And if you're like, oh my God, I got to figure this out, go to chapter 8 in her book. She says sometimes after we go with an approach to learning and it doesn't work, that there are times where we actually have to rethink our approach. She said after studying culturally oriented information processing methods to build independent learning, she says she always thought being culturally responsive was tying everything to a student's culture or race. Instead, she started thinking about how her instruction could be reshaped to focus on culturally grounded information processing. So if there's not 100% space for our stories, perhaps there's space to think about how is it that we process information based on our cultures and our upbringing. The last thing I want to talk about is the piece where you're going to get to a little bit later today. It's about alliance. And there's an old story told, it's one of my favorite Hasidic stories, about a father and a son who were traveling together. Their journey was going great. They were chatting, right? This is like horse-drawn carriage kind of thing, carrying their merchants, carrying their goods in their back of their carriage. Horse is going. They reach the road in front of them, and there's a boulder on the road. And father, a little bit, maybe too, not strong enough, older, not able to help the son. The son gets out. Dad, we're going to clear the road. We're going to make a pathway for us. And the son goes, and he starts pushing the rocks, pushing the boulder away, and it's not moving. The son tries everything. He tries to lift it. He tries to push it. He tries to run at it, and you can see the sweat and the tears are coming. He goes back to his son. I can't do it, Dad. Have you tried everything? Dejected, he walks back, and he tries 3 more ways. Comes back to his father. I can't do it, Dad. He's sweating, he's crying. He's got to spend every ounce of his strength. And he goes back to the trust one more thing, and he said, "Dad, I'm done. We're going to have to turn around." His father says to him, "Have you tried everything?" He said, "Yes, I tried everything." He goes through all the things he has tried. He said, "Son, you haven't tried everything. You haven't asked me for help." That's where the alliance comes in. There are times when we, as the teacher in our spaces, have to be that person who says, "Have you asked me for help?" There are times as teachers, we might say that we've tried everything to reach a student. There's a great group of folks in here to look around to say that when we have tried everything, who is it that we can turn to say, "These are the things that I'm trying"? What are your thoughts? Angie talked about being vulnerable in that video. We want to feel that sense of confidence, but that vulnerability creates that space for us to say, how can I even grow? How can I turn and achieve what I want? How can I build that partnership with the student? One of the things that I had in my head, I didn't create this as an image, but I have like these two arrows coming to each other. And that, we have the content in the middle, and you've got the teacher, you've got the student. Maybe we're sitting on the opposite side of the desk, but what happens when you move one of those arrows and you start pushing together, right? How can we build that alliance? Well, it begins with understanding our fears. It begins with recognizing that we have the space in our classrooms to really understand our students and recognize that they have the ability to grow. And then, of course, it concludes by building that alliance that says, "I'm going to ask for help." Sometimes when we're sitting with a student, let's just name the challenge. How do we name it? How do we identify for that student what we're seeing that challenge might be? And then how can you use the relationship that we have to advance that growth? And knowing that every one of those students has that potential to really learn and show that they know what that material is. And the biggest question for us as teachers, we're lucky to have 45 minutes a day with our students. I teach 10th graders once a week. It's probably one of the best hours of my week, but I get an hour with them. So Retta Hammond says to us, well, we have to build relationships. We have to build that time into our classroom, into our learning. She said, we can't do all 25 students in a classroom at one time. Break it in every couple of weeks. Go with 5 students at a time to really understand who they are. How do we build those relationships? And over time, we build those connections. Every child deserves a champion. An adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists they become the best that they can be. I want to leave you with a question. In what ways will you be that champion? If there are a couple of questions, I'm happy to answer. If you're like, oh my gosh, there's a rabbi here, like I always have this question I wanted to ask a rabbi, even if it had nothing to do with what I just said, go for it. I'm happy to answer anything. Well, I can't say I'm happy to answer anything. I might not know the answer, so then I'll just... Thanks, Kelly.
Rabbi, this question is...
Can you tell me who you are and
I'm Eric
where you
Bergeson.
teach?
Eric Bergeson, I'm a library media specialist at Kilmore Middle School, but I used to be a Spanish teacher. And so I wanted to ask about any of your mom's wisdom that she may have lent to you. Was there something that lingered with you about how she interacted with kids, or some just small piece of advice that she gave you?
Thank you. Oh my gosh. You know, my mom was a big influence in my life. There's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about her and her memory, and I share, and I bring it forward with me each and every day. There's 2 things I think about specifically. One, every summer, I would go, even through high school, maybe a little bit in college, I would go into my mom's classroom, and we would help decorate it. And my mom's classroom was like a museum for Spanish. Like, I mean, you could, sometimes it might have driven you crazy a little bit if you couldn't understand, like, when you could not, if you got distracted anywhere you looked, there was an opportunity for you to learn something and it changed, but we would spend so much time. And I recognized that my mom understood that it wasn't just about the material that she was teaching, but that there was so much about the cultural diversity that she would want to raise up for those students. The other thing that I thought was important for my mom was when she was assistant principal as a Spanish speaker, she would often be the one who would have to be the translator for the students, whether if they had any kind of academic hearing or discipline hearing. I mean, and I think about what that must be to be that translator, and especially from a position of kind of authority, right? But even in that position of authority, she was there to be able to be that gift that helped bridge that challenge. The last thing that was interesting that happened, I was a sophomore in college, and I was home for winter break. And even though my mom at the time knew I wanted to be a rabbi, I was still making that pathway to get my degree in Spanish and secondary education. And I, for a number of reasons which I don't recall, they had a number of Spanish teachers in a classroom that didn't make it, and they were without a teacher. So here I am, I speak Spanish, I taught a little bit, I spent my summer at camp teaching in very informal setting. I was like, I made a joke at dinner, Mama, I'll come in and teach. Well, my mom took me up on the offer. She was the Spanish chair, and what I was grateful for her in those moments was actually for really sitting down with me. Even though I was her son, she really cared about the however many classes I was going to be teaching and those students and wanting to give them something. And I think that's what she never stopped. She always focused on those students and wanting to raise them to help be the best that they could become. So that's thank you for asking. That's a great question. Others? Yeah.
Taken back to your...
Tell me who you are, where you teach.
I'm Claire Cressman. I teach 6th grade science at Worthington Way. And I guess I really like the quote that you talked about with, like, to save a life or to just, like, the lives that you have that could be destroyed. And I guess my question is, if, let's say you encounter somebody that has maybe been in that destroyed state, like what would your first step be for a child that has just been, or like maybe was destroyed in the past year or has just been destroyed? Like what is that first step to get back to the path of being saved?
So, this is, as a rabbi, this is the kind of thing that happens a lot, whether it's a kid or an adult, right? I sit with folks who really have had those broken moments, and I actually just ask them to tell me their story. And being present to listen to that story and with a total objective listener, it's just that moment of listening that allows them to tell the story of their challenges and their brokenness, that allows you to help even enter that space of being an ally. Often I think some people don't feel as though, especially when they're broken and the world is dark around them, that they don't have that ally. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking for to be able to tell that story, to be able to even cry a little bit. And from that kind of opportunity to listen comes questions. It comes those moments of light in the darkness. And then once you've known their brokenness, it goes back to the first story. It allows you to know that they have that potential to grow and that you really can care deeply about them. So I hope that's a helpful answer. But it's hard. It's also not easy. It requires us to be a little vulnerable, to sit with that brokenness. But I also want to say that we don't ever have to be the one to provide the answer and the response and to completely solve that problem, because we may not have those skills, and that's also when we have to potentially use the resources to say, oh, do you know about this? We might want to keep our eyes on that too, and there's those opportunities as well to find the other support structures in our schools that can be supportive, or even reaching out to the parents and say, hey, I just want to check in. This is really, can you help me understand that too? So there's a couple of different things I think that are helpful there. Do we have time for one more? Please. Once again, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Angie and to Kelly and to the district for inviting me to speak here. As I mentioned at the beginning, I really want to say thank you. I hope this is a wonderful rest of your day of learning. The opportunities that I have to have professional growth, I always love, and I want to say that if I can be a resource for any of you, the district knows how to find me, and there's one synagogue in Worthington. Just Google it.